we're off. Rog, over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I will share my screen. 1 moment. Working out how to do that. Okay. Oops. Why did it's not there? All right. Hello. So I thought we'll have talk about. I'll talk about modules a bit and this new proposal, and then hopefully we'll have some questions and we'll have a chat about aspects of that. And actually, one thing I haven't mentioned in that is that we're planning to have a regular call to talk about modules in the future as well. So as things go forward, the times have probably been arranged, but I haven't got them here, so I can't remember. And so for that, I think that most people here are familiar with the proposal, but perhaps not everyone. So at the moment, it's in sort of 4 sections, one of which is a kind of umbrella proposal, and I've linked to the discussions here, which link to the actual underlying documents. And the top level thing talks about the overarching design of what we're proposing for modules, and then there are various sub proposals which talk about various bits and details. So there's one that talks about how we plan to store, with the format we plan to store the modules in, what we plan to make initially a GitHub app to publish them, and some less some sort of earlier stage documents, let's say, we're talking about security and backwards compatibility. So just as a sort of overview, what actually do we mean about for modules in Q? And basically we're talking about reusable Q components, parts of bits of Q that can pull across, that you can pull into, that can act as common sources of schema or templates or all sorts of anything you like in Q. And one of our design goals really is that we make this a predictor. When you ask for a module, you know what you're getting. It's predictable. So it doesn't necessarily just go out and get whatever's there, at any one moment, and then a moment later it might change. And we think that by doing that, we're going to end up with something where Q in general is predictable and reliable. And what we're not trying to do with modules, although there are definitely places where this sort of thing is needed, and where there's lots of interesting things to build here, but what we're not trying to do with modules here is a way of getting your dynamic configuration data. So we want it so that if you say import some path, that's something that's essentially static and well known, and not something that's computed at build time. So that means that when you have a module, it's as I said, a reliable component. So talk about the proposal as bit. We started off talking about from Go, because we all came from a Go background, and Marcel had already started with Go influence, like a lot of the syntax, of course, is taken from Go. And Go's modules, they're distributed in the sense that when you import a module, when you run the thing, logically it goes directly to an arbitrary VCS or somewhere on the internet to pull down the source for a module. And to deduplicate, when you've got multiple versions of a module required, then it uses this very simple algorithm invented by Russ Cox called minimal version selection, which essentially chooses the latest version of any of the required versions. And then there's a proxy which makes things a lot faster, actually. So when you pull something from the proxy and the proxy doesn't know about it, it then goes to the back end, pulls down the right version from the VCS itself, and then makes it available to you. And then there's an HTTP sort of REST-like API, which the proxy serves up. So how's what we're proposing different from Go? Like, I think that in general, Q is often used in situations like in cloud deployments, in all sorts of places where you actually care about what very much about what where on the internet something's going to be dialing out to. So you often have strict egress controls. So going direct to VCS to the network is not necessarily a good idea. And also, like, actually, with respect to that, unlike Go, you're not running a build step before compiling and then deploying the resulting binary to somewhere. You're actually running the queue wherever you're going to. You don't have an artifact that you're going to run later. So Go gets away with it largely because you can take this compiled artifact, and that compiled artifact, of course, has all the modules built into it, and so it doesn't need to go to those VCF places. But Q doesn't have this, and we want to make it possible to use modules on anywhere the Q is deployed quite easily, and having the requirement to, for example, talk Git or all the other VCS systems, CV, all these Subversion, all these different things, that actually, that's problematic in a lot of the places we want Q to be deployed. So I think that what the way we're proposing is that we're not going to do that, I think. And also other things turn out problematic. So private modules are hard in the Go model. I'll talk about that in a later slide. And another aspect that we're different from Go is that we think that Go puts the major version inside every import path everywhere, and that it actually makes it quite hard to update major versions. And we suspect that people will be updating major versions more often in a configuration sense. So we've made it so that the major version can be inferred from the major version in the module file. So that's definitely a difference from Go, although logically the actual import path does have the major version in it. So it's just that the information is shared differently across the module. So there's various things that are still the same as Go's model. Like, we're still using the same syntax. We're still using minimal version selection. But we still technically have major versions and import paths, and we have so you can have the thing about the major versions and import paths is that you get exactly one version of any major version of any module, but you can have multiple major versions of a single module. But as I said, that's not always required now. And the other thing that is still the same is that our import paths is still domain name oriented. So we're not going to some system like JavaScript has, for example, where you have where you essentially have this domain name, this name grab at the start, because you don't have any qualification on your names. And that there are some downsides to that, of course, because your import paths are longer, but there are a load of upsides too. And in fact, it makes it easy to have a global namespace for modules without worrying about clashes, and DNS becomes your sort of arbiter. So as I said, I'd talk about some issues of why private modules are hard in Go. And so Go private, for example, is the way you can have private modules in Go. So if you say Go private, then it will go directly to the to the source. But of course, then it's slower, right? Because it's going directly to the source. So you don't get the advantage of a proxy if you configure Go private. Everyone has to set Go private. If you don't set it, then your details can leak. And of course, you might have several different places. The authorization might be different in different places. So the Go team has struggled with this for quite a while. They still haven't got a good design. It's a serious problem, and we think that private modules are a really important aspect. Whereas with if you have what we're proposing as a single registry, which is you can configure that, you can configure authorization for that one place, and you basically you've got one for a given queue evaluation. You're essentially talking about one source of truth, for one logical source of truth for where all your modules are coming from. As I'll say later, that doesn't necessarily mean that all your things are actually coming from one place, but logically that's what it works. So when you configure the queue tool, you would configure what that registry is, and that's not, you're not necessarily talking to the central registry. You might be talking to a registry that you've set up. And what we're proposing now, after various feedback from people, which is really useful, is that registry is an OCI registry. So you will get modules directly from via using that OCI protocol. And there's a sort of key insight here is that when you import something from an import path, the import path might say github.com/foo/bar, but that's not where you're actually getting the module from. The queue tool is going to the registry and asking for that thing which is in the registry. Now that might represent where on the internet that came from originally, or it might not. But there's this kind of level of indirection between your input path and where this thing comes up, and that indirection is implemented by a registry instance that you talk to. Now, I said there's a single registry, but we are also proposing to have a central registry, because I think that's really helpful for the ecosystem, because mainly, for the main reason is we want everyone to agree what public modules mean. So when one person imports module A and another person imports module A, you're going to agree what that module A actually means. And there's a bunch of other things which can come from that. We want it to be so when you say a given module at a given time, it's immutable. It's not going to change. If I pull module A and somebody else pulls module A at a later time, that's not going to change. This is not the case for VCS, for example, because a GitHub repository can change over time. It's not the case for most network-based resources. So by having a central registry where it gives those assurances, that's, I think, going to be really useful. And the other thing that you can do with the central registry is you can have some assurance that actually things are well formed. For example, that if you pull a module, that all its dependencies are actually available and well formed. That you can make sure that the queue is actually syntactically okay. You can check, for example, backwardly that when somebody publishes a new version, that it's backwardly compatible with an old version. You can also add attestations, so sort of signed statements to say that some of these things are actually true, and those attestations can be copied. So one of the advantages of having this OCI registry thing is that there are existing tools that can copy from between registries, and there are lots of existing registry implementations, including out of the box deployed with any cloud deployment, that can serve this protocol. So you'll be able to copy queue modules between registries. So if you want to have your own local set of, or local to a particular region set of dependencies, you can easily copy that just using off-the-shelf tools, and that will also copy the signed statements, the attestations that attest to that those are actually have all the properties you care about. So I saw a question go by, which was like the overview of the advantages of an OCR registry. I think that's the fact that it's an existing protocol, it's fit for purpose, it's deployed everywhere, there are lots of implementations. That seems to me a really strong advantage of using the OCI protocol. Because originally we were thinking of doing something like the Go proxy protocol, which is actually advantageous in some ways. That the OCI protocol is designed for large images. It's not perfect. You have more round trips than technically necessary, but still the other advantages seem to outweigh that, any minor disadvantages like that. And actually, I've been playing with the protocol a bit. So I actually wanted, I was experimenting with it. I wanted something, a registry implementation to test with, an in-memory implementation for tests, and there was none. So I actually ended up making this this package. Well, it's actually a module, Go module, that makes it really straightforward to build stuff with OCI registries. And it's a, technically, I guess it's equivalent to some of the existing Go ecosystem, but it's way simpler. You can kind of compose registries in a way that you can kind of filter them, you can unify them together, you can easily make an in-memory implementation or a proxy just by gluing a bit of code together. So that's, I mean, it's still very much a work in progress, but I think that's a nice enabling factor. So when somebody says, "Oh, actually, you're talking to a registry," that's really inflexible because you need to talk to one of these big heavyweight implementations that are really awkward to deploy. Well, like actually, no, it's like 5 lines of Go to make a registry, sort of that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily inflexible. Oh, and the other thing, so if it becomes, if we need to, if we want to, this thing, like, it's got very low dependencies, we could easily make that part of the queue tool. So if you actually needed a way to say, oh, actually we want to talk to multiple registries, we'll multiplex, we'll unify them all together, well, that could actually be just part of the queue tool. What does single registry is not restrictive? So what I mean by that is that although the queue tool is logically talking to a single registry, that actual registry can be a composition of other registries, and that doing that is not necessarily it is a tooling issue. It's not necessarily a hard thing to do. So that's why I feel that it's not actually restrictive in practice, even though logically it might seem so. In terms of how we actually plan to store modules inside the registries, one of the key things that I think is good is that each module is self-contained. It actually has a layer for the code in the module, but it also essentially reifies it, takes all its dependencies and puts them directly inside the module itself. So if you download one module, then you'll get the module and its dependencies. Of course, you don't have to download, the queue tool doesn't have to download the entire module, because in the OCI format, these things are independent. You have independently downloadable layers. So each dependency, so if you already have a dependency, you don't have to download it again. But that means that essentially your module, you know that you can evaluate a module, and you know if you use the standard copy commands like scopio copy or whatever, then you know that the modules that you copy will be self-contained. And the fact that registries do deduplication means that you won't actually be paying the price of having these logically different copies. They're only logically different copies. They're not actually they're not actually physically data copied. And that means that if you attest to a module, that signature will actually, as a matter of course, attest to everything that the manifest, the OCI manifest, points to. And yes, so the OCI format implies sort of this content addressed type thing. But what the content addressing there is, it refers to, it generally refers to the archives, but actually the archives, when we hash, when we have to do some assurance on content, there is actually various ways we can hash the content, because you can hash the archive, which is what OCI does, that the sort of binary blobs containing, but actually sometimes you want to be you're more concerned about the files. And one thing came up from George Fermi, who's not here. He was like, oh, maybe we should hash some canonical form of the contents. Now, I think that last is kind of hard, and but there are possible use cases for it. So I think it's possible we might have multiple hashes, so that if you just have the files, you can have assurances to those files, but the OCI ecosystem can still work with its hashes of blobs as well. So initially, we're not planning to do attestation. We're not planning to do private modules. We're best starting, as our kind of initial proof of concept, just to get things going. We're planning on just having support for GitHub hosted public modules. And that actually, from our point of view, that sidesteps a bunch of issues around authorization and authentication. So because we can get the app you authorize the app to be able to read from your GitHub repository, and the app will, on our behalf, pull from that repository and push to the central registry. That, as I say, that's an initial step. The app might well stay around, but there will probably going to be other ways to upload content from the store. But that's how we plan to start, because that allows us to not design a lot of quite tricky things, like authorization and authentication and all that stuff. We can get a lot of value just by allowing people to publish stuff from GitHub like that. So here's a little diagram of how that might actually work. So Alice is publishing a module. She installs the GitHub app, which makes a trigger, which currently doesn't do much. But then they publish, they tag, they add a tag to tag for v001, and then she writes the so no, that's what she says. So he creates the module, writes the module code, commits, and then does a tag. Actually, that would be q-v001, because we want as we said in the proposal, we want the tags to be distinct from any other existing tags. Yeah, but it's your good that you made the diagram. Thank you, Paul. And then so they push the tags. and that would cause a trigger, which would cause a fetch, which would publish publish the module to the registry. All the permissions that it needs are absolutely the minimum that it requires, which is it requires read permissions, which, given that it only works on public modules anyway, is not something that anyone that should be difficult for people to grant, I would hope. So as far as what we're going to do next, we're gathering feedback from people now and in the future, and we hope to start landing some strictly experimental features in the core code to so that people can actually play with the experimental implementation, and so we can get experience. We can get experience of how modules might actually work in practice. So as past, that's not bad. I will stop presenting, and we already have some questions. Does the GitHub app handle domain verification? Well, yes. I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean by domain verification. Sorry, Cedric.
I'm assuming, in the Go system, right, if they're using the VCS fetching, like if you're able to fetch from that domain, that means they control it, right? But if you're pushing to a registry, how do you know that they own the domain they're declaring as their module?
So currently, what they're doing, using the GitHub app, they're not pushing to the registry. They're tagging in their GitHub repository. Okay. And the app sees that and then pulls from that GitHub repository into the equivalently named registry repository inside the central registry.
Is the module they declare in their, like the Q module, it has to match that GitHub?
Exactly. It has to exactly match. Yes.
Yeah, because I saw that example.com in that little. Okay.
Yeah. So that was. So that should not have been example.com. That should have been github.com/foo/bar.
Got it.
Whatever. Yeah. So no. My bad for not properly looking at the diagram.
It's a sub proposal down the line to TBD, basically.
Yeah. I mean, initially, no vanity domains, nothing outside GitHub at all, because basically we're implementing a subset that we know is okay. The rest is slightly up for grabs, in terms of how we would verify that someone has the right to push to a particular place in the namespace, for example.
The GitHub app doesn't constrain like future options, right? It's not
I don't believe it does. No.
Okay. Yeah.
The only thing it says is that the only thing it constrains us to say is that that GitHub app, GitHub Q modules will be available from GitHub in that namespace. But other than that, I think there's not a huge amount of constraint there.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I'd like to understand more about the choice and rationale behind saying a QMod download can only talk to one registry at a time.
So maybe I can try to explain it. So basically, the idea is it's very easy to implement, let's say, a load balancer or something outside the Q tooling that will multiplex. So multiplexer that multiplex like a module name to different registries.
Sure.
So basically, it simplifies the Q implementation tremendously to only say there's only one, like one registry, because there's different ways to multiplex. There's many different ways to do these things.
Right.
And it's not clear like what is the best way to do it. And this way, with the tooling that Roger provided in the OCI registry package, it should be quite easy to build like all kinds of multiplexers, however you want to do it.
Sure, but doesn't that shift the burden of effort from the tool to the user?
It does, and that's why the last bullet point said, like, okay, if there's a pattern that is emerging from this that is very common, that we see that most users want, it makes sense to include that pattern as a special case into the tooling. But right now we don't really know what patterns will be.
Right. Well, so it seems to me like if I want to publish my modules to GitHub Container Registry, for example, to make them available to other people, then in order for them to use them, they have to mirror them. Or like I have to push them to the centralized registry for anybody. Otherwise, in order for somebody to use my module, there's all these extra steps they have to do.
Well, there's one extra step, right? You have to push to the central registry.
I have to, but like if I wanted to push to GitHub Container Registry, then any user of my module has to do extra steps to set up this multiplexing scenario. Whereas like every other dependency management system has this ability to talk to multiple registries at the same time. So I'm trying to understand the deviation between like what, the way every system works today, and YQ is choosing to say we'll only talk to one thing at a time.
Can I just ask a quick question? Is this a public module you're talking about here, Tony, in your example, or is it a private one? Okay.
Yeah, either or, really.
So, Rog, I just have just a couple of clarifying questions. So, if back to the attestations point, Rog, that you were talking about earlier on, because my understanding, and you can tell me if this is wrong or not, is that the idea behind the central registry is that it also serves the purpose as something like the SumDB in the Go world, of having like a common shared understanding of what version 1, Tony, of your module represents, right? So as I understand it, therefore, if we don't have a version of your module in the central registry, i.e. the SumDB equivalent, then there is no agreement on what the sort of the canonical version of that is in some way, shape, or form, in a way that people can then trust. And I'm thinking supply chain security. Am I holding that correctly, Rog, in terms of the role that the central registry would perform there? Or?
That's certainly a role for it, yes.
Yeah.
Well, so OCI hashes and like the attestations being part of the manifest, isn't that like the SumDB distributed with the artifacts anyway? And so, the attestation is in this registry, it basically lives with the artifact anyway, so it doesn't really matter which it is. We don't even know which attestation or if multiple attestation schemes are going to win. And maybe there's more, but they typically live right with the artifact anyway. So in that sense, the SumDB is distributed. I think another use case, right, is like if I want a private module, like I'm therefore, as soon as I have one private module, I'm required to mirror all my dependencies at that point, right? So that adds a burden to private modules, does it not? If I can only talk to one registry and it's in my private registry in my cloud, then anything else I use means I have to mirror it. And that's like another process that anybody wanting to use private modules wants to use. Whereas if we had a distributed design to this, then I could get from multiple registries. I have some private, some public, some come from the Q managed public registry, or official registry, let's say, rather than centralized. But I can also get modules from other places. I think two big use cases. I want to publish from my own registries, public modules, and also I want to have private modules. As soon as I have one private module, am I now forced to like mirror the world? Well, that's like a big hurdle for a lot of people to get behind.
So a few answers to the questions. So there's a bunch of questions there. So firstly, so with this flexible registry that you can implement, right? Like you don't have to necessarily mirror it. Like you can implement any strategy you want. So that's why we're saying it's not so clear what strategy people might want. So the other thing is with attestation. So the level of attestation that the central repository provides is more than just the SumDB, right? We'll also give some guarantees about backwards compatibility and all these things. And then or at least some attestation thereof, right? That is the plan. And then in some of the sub proposals, there is, so this is sort of a V1 thing or V0, right? Like there is some thought of how we could do indeed this distributed registry thing where basically so where you can do that basically, so where the domain name will tell you, or maybe it's some vanity URL or whatever, where it will refer to, okay, here's the registry where it's stored. We could still have a central sort of validation, right? Like the Q team says these are backwards compatible and all that, or all that kind of stuff. So but this is more like a next version thing. Roger, maybe if.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways of thinking about the multiple registry thing. So one is, so the Go approach is distributed in that when you have a module path, you know from that module path where to go to in order to get it, right? So that means that the module path is determining where you're going to fetch it from. The other sense is that there are multiple possible sources for different modules independent of the module paths. And I think those are two actually very different things. So what you're talking about, so for example, the functionality provided by NPM, if we like the NPM scopes you pointed towards, which I thought was interesting, but that's essentially saying that that we're like at the kind of tooling level, we're mapping from scope to somewhere to a registry to get it from. And I think that, so what I don't think we want is for, and yeah, what we're specifically saying that we're not doing is that a module name maps to where you're getting it from, because I think that's awkward, because that means that logically you have to go to a particular VCS system and a particular network address in order to fetch that module. But what we're not saying necessarily is that there is only, I mean, we're saying logically it's a single registry. But what we're really meaning there is that we've got logically a single registry namespace, which might be composed of several other registries, right? And that might even be done in the Q tool. So you could say, I could imagine a configuration option that to say, oh, actually for, like similar to Go private, but basically saying, oh, for anything in the matching this module pattern, we'll go to this registry for anything. But the two don't necessarily have to match, right? So that registry does not necessarily have to specify where you're actually getting that from. Does that
yeah, no, this is
clarify
exactly
things?
how we're thinking about it with the Hawk mods, is that the user will be able to say, like, for this pattern, you go here for it. And so they can, and maybe by default, you just like, whatever the import path is, that's what you kind of assume it is, unless the user's configured it otherwise. So we are, you know, that like ghcr.io/my organization/GitHub package. You know, we publish some modules there.
So we're going the opposite. It's kind of the other way around. By default, we're going to a single registry, and you can do clever things to make it potentially go to different places, perhaps even based on the module name. You know, it's not beyond the bounds to actually have something dynamic that does that kind of thing. I you know, I'm not sure how useful that'll be, but you could do that.
Yeah, I think what I hear is that the people want private modules more than anything, more than public modules. And so what does this private modules, you know, story for a user look like? If I'm going to publish and consume private modules, but maybe there's like this like community created like Kubernetes or Terraform module, how can I use both? Like, I want to use this public thing, but I now need to have this private stuff on top of it, especially when you're talking about my cloud infrastructure.
So this is, I think that this is one of the places where having a sort of unified namespace, like a DNS oriented namespace, where you know that if I'm publishing, if I like say I've got some private modules, I've got them onto I'm acme.com, I've got them onto my namespace, and I know that I control that namespace, and I know that the central repository will not allow someone else to publish under that namespace, right? So that means that I can define my own modules under that namespace with no fear that they will clash with anyone else's module, which means that say I had a registry with just my private ones in there, and I have the global registry, I can unify those together into a single registry namespace that just looks like a single registry, right? And in fact, in that OCI registry repo, it's actually really straightforward to do. I've got a little thing that says unify. It takes two arbitrary registries, unifies them, right? So and any reads come from either of them, and writes go to both of them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people just don't want to have to run an extra server or registry service to use private modules. Like I got Google Artifact Registry. It supports a whole bunch of I can just put a bunch of private NPM, Maven, Go even now. I'm doing a whole bunch of private stuff there, and that's just my private stuff, and I don't have to configure anything else other than the tool itself. I don't have to run anything else.
So I see this as stage 2. Our design does not preclude this in any way. We haven't proposed it yet, but what you might yes, you could run a local server if you want, just like a local host server that acts as the registry, or maybe we build something into the Q tool to allow you to do that as part of the Q tool, right? So to map from.
Yeah, I think more like configuration or environment variable. You could kind of
there's a bunch of ways you could do it, and that is a bunch of design that we don't really do right now, right?
Sorry, can I just jump in, Marcel? Sorry, I see your hand up. But Tony, just to build on what Rog said, there is that I think your experience there, plus others who are like, hang on a second, how is this scenario covered in some way, shape, or form? Please keep that coming, right? Because we should work out where folks have got concerns or questions and make sure that we have, collectively, as in everybody here, right, collectively some good answer as to what the answer to that question is, right? And so that was my thought on, albeit perhaps in slightly more simplistic diagrammatic form, at least diagrams are relatively straightforward to communicate and understand, is that, okay, if it's not phase 1, but it is phase 2, what would that look like? And from like a sequence diagram perspective, what would it actually look like? What are the options, etc.? It just enables us to be a bit more concrete and precise. So please keep this kind of stuff coming, because I think it to my mind, it's exactly the right sort of challenge on it. Yep. Practically speaking, what are people going to do when they have situation X?
Yeah, so also to add to that, so you're now talking to a very specific use case, right? But so part of the design is also based on other input where it's like, yeah, this pulling from everywhere, what Go does, and like the unpredictability, we really want to prevent that, right? We want to have a single registry, make sure that it doesn't go anywhere else in the network. So there's these other use cases that take have these radically different requirements. Right, and then taking the single registry approach where you can sort of have these in the backend, all these different implementations, seems to be the easiest, at least for us conceptually right now, the easiest thing to do. I know we have to work towards some default that's easy for many people or most people, but for now this is sort of the.
Yeah, if it becomes difficult to use private modules, it's going to really hurt adoption.
Yeah, what we'd like to do is make it easy to use to vendor things as well, right? So if you want to, you generally quite possibly want to prevent your things from talking from getting dependencies from the central registry too, right? Yeah. So.
And the nice thing about this implementation is really easy and flexible to add different strategies, right? So if people say, once people say, okay, I'm using it, this is what I'm running into, it will be fairly easy to add these strategies, right? This is what having the single registry design makes it very flexible to add something later.
single logical registry is the point that I've taken a lot from what Roger's reiterated and the clarifications he's made to Tony, right, as to options down the line. I don't know. That's I'm not as close to the detail as Marcel and Roger, and so I'm sort of interpreting this in the context of Tony's question a bit as well. Because Tony, the pain with the private module stuff, if I think about my experience from the Go world, is absolutely real. And a big challenge. So if we can get that story good and straight, that really helps. I completely agree.
Yeah, I think the OCI deals like a lot with that.
Yeah,
Pain of
very
private
much so.
modules from the Go world. Certainly, there's like, it's really nice. We support Git tags based like Go does in our module dependency system, and it's so nice to just be able to push a tag and bam, I have a module that I can now use rather than having to push. At the same time, there's other times where it's been like nice to just be able to not push just like an arbitrary set of code to be used as a module somewhere else so that somebody else can try it out real quick, in a private setting.
I'm just going to say,
grab this tag from OCI. All you have to do is like pull this thing, or I'll get it in this case.
The whole thing of just pushing a tag, and Tiago, it kind of picks up on your point as well, of just pushing a tag and it working, has also been quite a massive source of foot guns and problems for people who've accidentally published things as well. And so the feedback in the Go space has been it has over time been that is like a double-edged sword, because some of the time it's good and some of the time it's bad. I'm not trying to land on one side of the fence.
I think one thing I see coming out of the Q module proposal is this idea of having like extra configuration around the module, like you see in all the other module systems that Go just pretty much, there's no like place to put like my configuration for my module in the module file, like the package.json or what have you for any other language. Go seems to lack that, where you could put this kind of like, do not publish this to a Git repository kind of thing. I guess talking to that like section in the proposal where it's like, this is a private module, it should not be ever made public. That kind of setting. There's like nothing like that in the Go world that I'm aware of.
So keep also in mind that the GitHub app, the way it's designed, since it's completely separate from the core module design, right? Like you can even imagine that you would have different GitHub apps publishing it with different strategies that that suits different people's needs. So instead of having a single, like central tool has this GitHub integration implemented that everybody then must adopt, this sort of decouples that, right? That's one reason behind it.
You could think of somebody like supporting like a .gitignore kind of capability in their module publishing.
Sorry, I did not.
Like gitignore.
Oh yeah, for example, yeah, or anything different.
.qignore in this case.
Is there a plan to put that in the q.mod directory? Like there's a module.q, right? I'm assuming that's where we're going to put meta configuration in.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is a place where you could put meta configuration.
A quick question on that file. Is that file and schema going to be open so that if other people want to throw extra metadata in the module.q, what does that look like?
My thought was that we might provide a place with some conventions in the file rather than making it entirely open. Oh, you can just put annotations anywhere, right? But have a known place where user data could go, because otherwise I think things become really hard.
Yeah, if you put like a nested like extra field or something like
essentially,
that.
I'm thinking of like a closed schema, but with one place in it that is open in a particular
one field that's open. Do you mean?
One field that's open, maybe with a map in it that might be keyed by domain name or something, or something, some way so that people can add their metadata, because of course you always have the risk of clashes, right?
Right, yeah.
Tony, can you just add a bit of context? I think I can guess where you're going with this in terms of from the Hoff side, and I think it's similar to the Timoni side, where it's certainly on the Timoni side that they've talked about this need or want for having additional information about the module itself, or whether it be meta information or packages within the root module, the root package within a module having a particular shape being something that identifies something as a half Automoni module. Is that the place where you were coming at from this, or something else?
Not for half modules. I wasn't really coming that way. Maybe thinking about something like Backstage or something where, like, you know, there's these tools that just scan repositories and look for extra information, and like there's ability to like put custom information in for like rendering or what have you. You know, in a Backstage,
okay,
plugin, you could do a lot of things.
Yep. And
so like people just may want to add like arbitrary labels, like this is a back end, you know, configuration.
I see. Yeah.
You know, where would I put labels on this module, kind of thing? I think a lot about labels, but
just incidentally, I think there's some. Just keeping an eye on the time, so I'll only make this point briefly and then stop. Is that if we are looking at opening up a field, Rog, within that, or having it as some other file, I think we end up approaching a question that's been asked in another issue, which is who controls the attribute namespace? Because in a similar way, even though attributes are obviously entirely unrelated, you have the question of who controls that namespace within the open field that you describe within the module file, because otherwise you have a sort of contention in some way, shape or form as to what's actually going on there, and that addressing within that namespace. So, but that's not for discussion now. I just raise it as
I think that's it's a really interesting thought, and I think you could probably leverage the same namespace that modules are in order
hopefully
to,
yeah. And that might actually inform something on the attribute side of things as well, but I leave that for another day too.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
It seems like a pretty common thing that's going to come up in Q, like even for what I'm trying to do with the saddle, right? Like trying to make sure that we can intermix different tool configurations in the same Q package, right? And that's why I was looking for that unique namespace for my stuff.
Yeah.
Same issue, right? And with the ownership and stuff. I think it's going to be pretty important. And to echo what Tony said, like, I think having meta configuration for repositories themselves, because it's significant abstraction, right? And be able to like actually store that information about that project or repository in the repository in a kind of reusable way for multiple tools makes a lot of sense and could be a value add for Q.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also worth considering that like package.json does not go under node modules, and that it's not in that modules folder. And like a lot of times these files, like these meta configuration files, are at the top level because like a lot of them have nothing to do with dependencies.
You might, for that matter, want to consider whether attestations actually are a better model for that kind of labeling of things, because they can obviously be added after the fact as well. Whereas it's something within the module.q file is part of the module and that's it. You're done. You checksummed everything. Whereas attestations, at least, Rod, you can tell me whether I'm holding that wrong in my head.
That's a really important part of it. Thanks, Tiago. Nice to see you. That's a really important part of attestations, in that you've got this this artifact that you know exactly what it is, but then you can analyze it. You can attest to properties of it. Like you can add labels, for example, after the fact without changing things. You can add labels to things that aren't yours, right? So I can take some third-party module and add some attestation that I care about, but they could care less about, that kind of thing. It's just we're about at time. There will be another call in 2 weeks' time on the 13th of July. So we're planning to carry on these discussions, and I would very much like it if those of you that here could, continue to think about this and follow what we're doing, and we'll give you an update on where we've got to then. Thanks very much for all your feedback.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Later.
Thanks, everyone. Speak soon.